Nietzsche was not a materialist. He developed a metaphysics, albeit one he intended as counter to the whole history of metaphysical thought since Socrates, and he would not have used the term metaphysics, but his system of thought does not present us with inert matter accidentally producing life. Rather, matter, down to the lowliest particle, is endowed of will. Will does not come into reality with biological life. Will is there from the beginning. Quote, all mechanical occurrences, insofar as a force is active in them, are force of will, effects of will, unquote. That's the basic proposition from section 36 of Beyond Good and Evil that this video will discuss. Let's look at that passage more fully. Quote, granted that nothing is given as real except our world of desires and passions, that we can rise or sink to no other reality than the reality of our drives, for thinking is only the relationship of these drives to one another, is it not permitted to make the experiment and ask the question whether this which is given does not suffice for an understanding even of the so-called mechanical or material world? I do not mean as a deception, an appearance, an idea, but as a more primitive form of the world of emotions in which everything still lies locked in mighty unity and then branches out and develops in the organic process. End quote. So will is there from the beginning in matter and then develops, branches out when matter is configured into organic life. Nietzsche continues, quote, in the end, the question is whether we believe in the causality of will. If we do so, then we have to make the experiment of positing causality of will, hypothetically, as the only one. One must venture the hypothesis that wherever effects are recognized, will is operating upon will, and that all mechanical occurrences, insofar as a force is active in them, are force of will, effects of will, end quote. And that last sentence is key. He goes on, quote, granted finally that one succeeded in explaining our entire instinctual life as the development and ramification of one basic form of will, as will to power, as is my theory. It's important, he describes this as his theory. Granted that one could trace all organic functions back to this will to power, one would have acquired the right to define all efficient force unequivocally as will to power. The world seen from within, the world described and defined according to its intelligible character. It would be will to power and nothing else, end quote. That's extremely exhaustive as a hypothesis. Not only organic life, but all mechanical process is will to power for Nietzsche. Modern philosophy of mind would call this a kind of pan-psychism, the theory that matter and energy has psyche, mind, or more properly, consciousness of some kind. It isn't that consciousness transcends phenomena. There is no pure consciousness beyond specific beings, no unitary consciousness at the root of all beings, but consciousness is also not what's called an epiphenomenon, an emerging quality, an accident of matter. When matter is organized just right, it somehow produces a spark of consciousness, even though it was not conscious itself prior to that. Rather, in panpsychism, consciousness is always already present as a property of matter. This is the view, I argue, that one finds in Nietzsche. To clarify, it isn't my view. This isn't classical metaphysics, in which consciousness is more fundamental to matter, the consciousness of God in theological terms, rather than merely a property of matter, but it is metaphysical, beyond the physical, if physicality is conceptualized, as it typically is today, as being devoid of consciousness, as the non-conscious bit of reality, as the externally observable properties of things. For the panpsychist, objective structure of reality includes a subjective dimension in itself. John Richardson, in his book Nietzsche's System, defends this interpretation of the mad philosopher's thought, but he warns us, quote, Nietzsche is highly suspicious of consciousness and stresses that what it gives us inwardly is also just appearance, not facts. End quote. Now, consciousness here means self-awareness as we experience it. The suspicion mentioned here is not just a suspicion of the accuracy of our perception of the world out there, but also suspicion to do with our self-perception, our sense of being a coherent unity rather than just a tangle of sometimes harmonious, sometimes dissonant drives. In fact, it's the presence of different drives that explains why we can take pleasure both in pursuing an object, the directed will, and at restraining our own will towards that desired object. The very nature of complex cognition is in a sense the result of contradictory drives for Nietzsche, as I read him. Indeed, the mighty unity Nietzsche mentions in that previous quote from Beyond Good and Evil isn't some ultimate unity which manifests in us, as us, but rather is the unity of primitive physical will which is merely complexified in the human organism. But what does this complexification, so to speak, bring? Put differently, what is the difference for Nietzsche between will to power in things in general, as distinct from self-conscious human beings? Well, it's our ability to restrain will, enjoy the pursuit of will, not just its final fulfillment. Quote from Richardson, Nietzsche attributes an unconscious purposiveness to all beings, or wills, because will to power is directed activity. It has two basic aspects, the movement itself and its aiming. As directed at ends, even the most primitive wills intend those ends and so exhibit an intentionality. This includes both a view of a goal and a view of surroundings or circumstances in and through which that goal is being pursued. I suggest that Nietzsche's spiritualization is a certain intensification and predominance of this intentional aspect at the expense of the concrete movement or enactment itself. The will grows ever more preoccupied with setting its course and ever less occupied with sailing it. So in the person, the drives become spiritualized as they hold off fulfillment and savor pursuit, savor keeping the goal in view before them, end quote. So all matter has some primitive will in it. That's the nature of all reality. But in the human being, because we are more complex, we're able to will and to observe that willing, restrain that willing, take pleasure in prolonging that willing, etc. But that's just the interaction of little bits of primitive will organized complexly in the human brain. It wouldn't be some higher source that is giving us that complexity, or in Richardson's passage, that spiritualization of the will. Where Nietzsche contradicts practically all established pre-modern religion and philosophy is in rejecting morality, so-called. But he isn't just rejecting social conventions and inherited institutions here. It runs far deeper. Classical metaphysics holds that if consciousness, by whatever name, including the consciousness of a divine creator, is essential, if there is a single unitary essence to reality, then the plurality of forms that manifest or are created by, in theological terms, this essence should be harmonious. Harmony manifests unity. What does harmony mean in human terms? In a word, morality or virtue. Morality is how we express the truth of ourselves and of reality. Hatred is less real than love. A parent loving its child is more aligned with the truth of reality than a parent who is numb to its child, according to the classical view. Beauty is more real than ugliness because it reveals harmony and therefore it reveals the primordial unity of reality. Order is more real than disorder. Those relationships that reveal the way different forms fit together, like men and women, are more real than attempts to join things that do not fit. Why? Because what tradition calls moral or virtuous is that which reveals to us the true nature of things, their shared essence, a oneness that expresses its transcendence by producing many different forms, because no one form could ever fully express it, who can all participate in a harmonious order, all fit together in specific ways. Harmony as the created image of transcendent unity, we could say. This is one way in which to understand traditional morality. But Nietzsche argued that the essence of things, the true nature of their consciousness, does not mean harmony is more revelatory of that true nature, but the opposite. Conflict and subduing of some by others through violence, power as expressed in one entity instrumentalizing another. This is truth. Quote, one has to think this matter thoroughly through to the bottom and resist all sentimental weakness. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of the strange and weaker, suppression, severity, imposition of one's forms, incorporation, and, at the least and mildest, exploitation, end quote. Section 259 of Beyond Good and Evil. That's a tremendous statement. Thus did Nietzsche reject all philosophy, morality. You can read section 191 of Beyond Good and Evil on his rejection of Plato and Socrates, for example, or his remarks on Zarathustra, and the history of moral thought in Ecce Homo. Now, in part, he concludes this because to him, consciousness is not one. It's a property of matter spread out throughout all of the chaotic flux of matter and energy in the universe. It is as multiple, as various as objects are numerous. It cannot serve to draw all things together. It is not a shared essence, only a common property. Indeed, we could argue that on some level, all panpsychism would have to end up agreeing with Nietzsche. If consciousness is inherent to matter but is not beyond matter, is not that unitary source which manifests reality, well then, it is no source of harmony. Whether it can be concluded to be the desperate cry in each thing to be more than it is by ripping away at other things is another issue. That's more gratuitous of Nietzsche. So the common will in all things is a source of conflict, not peace. But, says Nietzsche, human culture came up with systems that denied this reality, systems of metaphysics, systems of morality. The overman, the Übermensch, he hypothesized, as emerging in the future, was meant to come to terms with reality, accepting the meaninglessness of reality, which is to say the emptiness of morals apart from will to power, and for this he would need to have the ability to rule, inherited from masters of old, but also to abstract from things as they are and justify himself as the ancient slaves did. For slave morality consisted primarily in creating systems of value that had very little to do with the objective truth of life out there. Slaves had no choice but to create systems of morality that justified their miserable lives because objectively, they were the losers in the game of life. That's roughly the synthesis of master and slave morality, which the Übermensch represents, a convergence of opposite psychologies, I would argue. That's not the point of this video. Now, in terms of the need to create values, Nietzsche writes, quote, actual philosophers are commanders and lawgivers. They say, thus it shall be. It is they who determine the wherefore and whither of mankind, and they possess for this task the preliminary work of all the philosophical laborers, of all those who have subdued the past. They reach for the future with creative hand, and everything that is or has been becomes for them a means, an instrument, a hammer. Their knowing is creating. That's key here. The creating is a law-giving. Their will to truth is will to power. Are there any such philosophers today? End quote. And in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, we read that the individual's valuing of something is what creates value. Value does not pre-exist the individual. Quote, hear it, ye creating ones. Valuation itself is the treasure and jewel of the valued thing. Through valuation only is there value, and without valuation, the nut of existence would be hollow. End quote. And no one yet knoweth what is good and bad unless it be the creating one. Okay, so philosophy must cease grasping for truth, right and wrong, and embrace will to power, create values rather than discovering values. Not derive them from the structure of reality as such, but make them up, since the structure of reality is simply will to power. That which is common to beings is the one common cosmic race to conquer and consume. Now, if we question Nietzsche's metaphysics, we could ask, if all matter contains consciousness or will, why doesn't that consciousness remain at the level of an atom or a molecule? Why does it inhabit larger complex structures, experiencing from grander perspectives, like that of the human brain? This is a problem all panpsychism runs into. No matter how we organize matter, we are only ever describing objective structures and dynamics, not subjective experiences, qualia. That's the hard problem of consciousness, which the panpsychist tries to get away from by claiming that consciousness was always already there. When we realize this but deny a single source or essence, a unitary character to consciousness, we end up with panpsychism, but our ontology does not ground harmony, beauty, order as somehow more consistent with the nature of things than disharmony, ugliness, disorder. And this is an insight particularly stark in Nietzsche. Nietzsche, for his part, never really comes to terms with classical arguments for a transcendent consciousness, say Avicenna's necessary being, but we can imagine a version of Nietzsche's philosophy in which the will of different beings is understood as composing larger harmonies within which they remain differentiated, stemming from an ultimate will, an ultimate consciousness, as their own deepest nature, but retaining Nietzsche's critique of elements of Christian piety as world denying, the exaltation of celibacy or poverty as a higher calling, for example, pacifism, certain aesthetic preference for the weak or the sick over the strong and the healthy. These are not essential to Christianity, but they do crop up in Christian culture and can be critiqued from a spiritual perspective. And there's a lot that's valid in Nietzsche's criticisms there. To recap, matter/energy, all mechanical occurrences, insofar as a force is active in them, are endowed of subjectivity, and this subjectivity can be described as will. Will is ever directed towards increase at the expense of other instances of will. Now, in the human being, many drives, many forces of will may contradict, which allows us to deceive ourselves into accepting our own subjugation, but also allows us to restrain one will by means of another within ourselves, and so achieve great things. Will is a property of matter or force, whether inorganic or living, and so is always within contingency for Nietzsche. There is no absolute necessary will or consciousness, no simple, non-composite, non-mutable cause of all composite mutable beings. No God, as in classical metaphysics. If transcendent unity was the ground for created harmony in classical thought, Nietzsche's system lacks such justification for harmony and instead posits disharmony as the state of things. However, many of Nietzsche's psychological and cultural critiques, which I haven't dealt with here, can be plugged into a classical metaphysics, I contend. One can take a lot of his observations on board while rejecting his denial of God, of classical metaphysics. But truer will to power would assert itself, its union to transcendent good as its own essence, without needing, quote, suppression, severity, imposition, exploitation, as we read in Beyond Good and Evil. A truer will to power would have to transcend the need for violence upon weaker forms. The need it has for those weaker forms to be weak in order to itself be strong, and would instead embrace the classical conception of supreme good. In fact, as we read Nietzsche, we sometimes get the sense that he did have that intuition as well. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that was interesting. Subscribe if you would like to, and until next time.